The snow wasn't just cold, it was a killer. Each flake that landed on the woman's bruised face was a tiny frozen nail, sealing a coffin of ice around her. Her little girl, just 7 years old, was already half buried in a drift, a small ghost in the making. They had been cast out by the town, their home swallowed by the storm behind them. But what the men who did this didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that they weren't just casting out a woman. They were casting out a secret that could burn their whole righteous town to the ground. The woman stumbled, her body a symphony of pain. Her left leg dragged, a dead weight. The bruises on her face were the color of a dying twilight. "Keep walking, my heart," she rasped, her voice like grinding stones. "Just keep walking." The girl, Lily, nodded, her own breath a white cloud in the air, a ghost that refused to leave its body. Their footprints were a fading prayer in the snow, a story the wind was already erasing. Somewhere ahead there had to be mercy. There had to be light. But the mountain didn't care about mercy. It just loomed, a dark judge in a white courtroom. "Mama," the girl whispered, her voice snatched by the wind. "Does God see us out here?" The woman's throat tightened. "If he does," she said, forcing a smile that cracked the blood on her lip, "I hope he remembers our names." The child smiled back, a flash of pure trust in a world that had offered only betrayal. But trust couldn't fight the cold. The last light of day finally gave up, and so did the woman's legs. She fell to her knees, pulling Lily down with her. The cold wasn't just on her skin anymore. It was inside her bones, a deep, final chill. Her mind screamed, "Move!" But her body had already surrendered. It whispered back, "No." Lily pressed her tiny, frozen palms to her mother's cheek. "Mama, get up! Please get up!" The woman tried to speak, but her lungs were filled with ice. She closed her eyes, ready for the end. And that's when she heard it. A sound that shouldn't exist out here. Faint, rhythmic, real. The thud of an axe splitting wood. Her eyes snapped open. The girl was already pointing. Through the blizzard, a flicker of orange. A light in a window. A heartbeat of warmth in a world of white. It could be a trick of her dying vision. It could be a trap. But it was also the only hope they had left. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she got to her feet, clutching her daughter's hand. "We go," she whispered. "We go now." The light grew stronger as they fought their way up the slope. It was a promise. It was a lure. When they finally collapsed against the rough wood of the cabin door, the woman could barely lift her fist to knock. Once, twice. Then a heavy, waiting silence. The sound of the axe had stopped. Someone was inside. Someone had heard them. And in this wilderness, a stranger was more likely to be a devil than a savior. Inside, the man didn't move at first. He'd lived alone for so long, the sound of a human knock was like a language he'd forgotten. He was a large man, built of the same stone and timber as the mountain itself. His beard was wild. His eyes held the deep, quiet stillness of a frozen lake. He talked only to the wind and the fire, and they never asked for anything. The knock came again, weaker this time, desperate. He rose slowly, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and crossed to the door. He pulled the heavy plank open. Snow and wind exploded into the room, a living, breathing monster. And on his doorstep stood 2 ghosts, one large, one small, covered in ice and blood. For a moment, he thought the mountain was playing tricks on him, sending spirits to test his sanity. Then the little girl looked up, her voice a tiny, brave needle in the storm. "They beat Mama," she said, "and they cast us out of the city." The man's breath caught in his chest. His gaze drifted from the girl's determined face to the woman's broken one. But he didn't just see the bruises and the blood. He saw the story beneath them. He saw the town in the valley, a place he knew better than anyone. a place of false prophets and real monsters. His eyes looked past her, out into the storm, as if he wasn't just seeing them. He was seeing a memory. Another woman, another child, another night just like this one. He stepped aside without a word. "Get in." The woman stumbled past him, her legs finally giving out. He caught her arm, his grip surprisingly gentle, as if he were afraid she might shatter. The girl scurried in behind her, and he shut the door, the sound a final, deafening boom that sealed the three of them inside his world. The wind howled outside, furious at being denied its prey. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and their ragged breaths. He moved around them, never looking directly at them, pouring something hot and herbal into 2 wooden cups. The woman huddled by the fire, her body shaking uncontrollably. Lily stayed glued to her side, her wide eyes darting around the small, dark cabin. "We will go in the morning," the woman finally whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to trouble you." He turned slowly, his shadow a giant on the wall. "You won't make it through the pass tonight." She looked up, a spark of defiance in her exhausted eyes. "I'd rather freeze free than live warm in a cage." He met her gaze, and a long, heavy moment passed between them. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Rest. You can decide in the morning." She didn't argue. She couldn't. The child was already asleep against her, small hands curled like fallen petals. The man sat across the hearth, sharpening a large hunting knife, the scrape of steel on stone a steady, unnerving rhythm. Outside, a wolf howled, its voice filled with a lonely patience. The woman watched him through half-closed eyes. "Why?" she murmured, the question barely a breath. "Why did you open your door?" He didn't look up from the blade, its edge catching the firelight. "Because I once needed someone to open theirs," he said. "And nobody did." That night, the woman dreamed of angry voices and the smell of fire. The man dreamed of a small, unmarked grave on the ridge behind the cabin. And the girl dreamed of a place that didn't hate her just for being born. But as the storm raged, something else was moving in the darkness. Far down the mountain, on the same trail they had taken, a lone rider was pushing his horse through the snow. He wasn't sent by God. He was sent by the men who believed they were. He was a tracker, and he was hunting for a secret. When dawn broke, gray and cold, the man was already outside. The rhythmic thud of his axe echoed in the frozen air. The girl, Lily, woke to the sound and crept to the frosted window. He was bare-armed in the biting cold, steam rising from his skin as he worked. He looked like a part of the mountain, something ancient and powerful. She pressed her small hand to the cold glass. "He's not an angel, Mama," she whispered to her sleeping mother. "But he looks like one trying to remember how to be." Her curiosity won out over her fear. She pulled on her worn boots and slipped outside. The crunch of snow was loud in the stillness. He stopped mid-swing, the great axe held motionless in the air. He turned his head slowly. "You'll freeze," he said, his voice a low rumble. She just smiled, a small, trusting thing. "Are you lonely?" The question seemed to break through the ice around him. He lowered the axe, resting its head on the chopping block. "Sometimes." She tilted her head, her expression serious. "Then maybe God sent us." For the first time, a flicker of something that wasn't sorrow or anger crossed his face. It was almost a smile. "Maybe he did," he said, and went back to his work. But he moved differently now, with less fury and more purpose. As if he were no longer just splitting wood for a fire, but building a wall against the world. By noon, the woman, Alara, was awake. He brought her a cup of bitter coffee, his large, scarred hands surprisingly steady. "Thanks," she mumbled, staring into the fire, not at him. He just nodded and returned to his seat. For hours, the silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. Who are you? What happened to you? Why are you hiding from the world? But beneath the silence, a fragile trust was beginning to take root, as delicate as a winter flower. As night fell again, he finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air since they arrived. Who did this to you? Ilara didn't look at him. She stared into the hypnotic dance of the flames. Men who say they're good, she said, her voice laced with a bitterness so cold it could have put out the fire. They said a woman without a husband is a sin, walking on two legs. They said I didn't belong. He gripped the handle of the knife resting on his knee, his knuckles turning white. They lie easy, don't they? A sound escaped her lips that was almost a laugh, but it was sharp and broken. Easier than breathing. The room fell silent again. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. You're safe here, he said, the words spoken so quietly she almost missed them. Her eyes finally met his, searching for the cost of his protection, for the price of his kindness. Safe, she whispered, is a word I forgot how to believe. He gave that same single nod. Then, maybe it's time to remember. Just then, his head snapped up. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was listening, to something outside, something beyond the sound of the wind. Ilara strained her ears, but heard nothing. What is it? She asked. He put a finger to his lips, his body tense as a coiled spring. He rose silently and moved to the window, peering out into the swirling darkness. After a long moment, he turned back, his face grim. We have a visitor. He didn't mean the tracker. He meant something much older. A pair of yellow eyes stared back at him from the edge of the trees. A wolf, massive and gray, stood as still as a statue watching the cabin. It wasn't howling. It was waiting. It's just a wolf, Ilara said, her heart pounding anyway. The man shook his head. That's old Scar, he said. He never comes this close to the fire. Not unless something spooked him. Something down valley. He grabbed his rifle from the pegs above the hearth. Lock the door behind me. What are you doing? She cried, scrambling to her feet. You can't go out there! He ignored her, checking the rifle's mechanism with practiced hands. Something's coming up the trail, he said, his voice flat and hard. The wolf smells it, and I'd rather meet it on my own terms. He opened the door just a crack, slipping out into the night like a shadow. The door clicked shut, and the heavy bar fell into place behind him. Ilara was alone with the sleeping child, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was trapped with a man who ran out to meet monsters in the dark. For what felt like an eternity, she waited. The fire seemed to shrink, pulling its light and warmth into itself. The shadows in the corners of the cabin grew long and menacing. Every creak of the logs, every skitter of the wind, sounded like footsteps, like the men from the town, like they were right outside, their knuckles about to rap on the door. Lily stirred in her sleep, murmuring a name. Not Mama. A different name. A name Ilara had never heard before. Silas. The name hung in the air, a strange and sudden prophecy. Was that the mountain man's name? How could her daughter possibly know it? A new kind of fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara's exhaustion. Who was this man, really? What secrets was this mountain hiding? The heavy bar on the door began to lift. Slowly, silently, from the outside. Ilara's blood turned to ice. It wasn't possible. The bar could only be moved from the inside. She backed away from the door, grabbing an iron poker from the hearth, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The door swung inward with a low groan, revealing the man standing there, his rifle in one hand, a dead rabbit in the other. Snow clung to his beard and shoulders. Something for the pot, he said, as if he hadn't just terrified her half to death. He didn't seem to notice her fear, or the poker in her hand. He kicked the door shut and dropped the heavy bar back into place. "How did you do that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The bar. You lifted it from the outside." He looked at the door, then back at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Old cabin," he said, turning away to skin the rabbit. "Got its own secrets." The answer was no answer at all. It was a warning. This place, this man, they were full of hidden passages and secret locks. He was offering her safety, but it was a safety she didn't understand. A fortress with rules she didn't know. She put the poker down, but she didn't relax. The feeling of being trapped was stronger than ever. She watched him work, his hands moving with brutal efficiency. He was a survivor. A man who knew how to lift bars from the wrong side, who faced down wolves, who spoke of the town with a quiet, burning hatred. He wasn't just a hermit. He was a guardian. Or a prisoner. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, watching Lily's peaceful face. The child murmured the name again. Silas. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The next morning, as the man, Silas, was outside, she searched the cabin. It was a desperate, foolish thing to do, but she had to know. The small space was sparse, holding little more than tools, traps, and furs. But in a small, loose-lidded chest at the foot of his cot, she found it. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, and beneath it, a worn, leather-bound book. Her hands shook as she opened it. It wasn't a journal. It was a Bible. But tucked inside the front cover was a drawing, done in a child's unsteady hand. A drawing of a smiling man, a woman with long, dark hair, and a little girl. Underneath the drawing were 3 names: Silas, Annabelle, and Sarah. Ilara shut the book, her heart aching. The grave on the ridge, the child's doll she'd thought she'd imagined on the wall, the haunted look in his eyes. He hadn't just lost someone. He had lost everyone. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was living in a tomb of his own making. She heard the crunch of his boots in the snow outside and quickly put the book back, closing the chest just as the door opened. He walked in, his arms full of firewood. He paused, looking at her, then at the chest. He knew. He knew she had looked. The silence was deafening. He dropped the wood by the hearth, the crash making her jump. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He just looked at her, his face a mask of old, cold grief. "Some things are better left buried," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had clearly fought to keep down for years. "I know," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry." He turned away, staring into the fire that wasn't there. "The preacher in your town," he said, his back to her. "The one who speaks for God. What's his name?" Ilara was taken aback by the question. "Eli, Preacher Eli." Silas went rigid. For a long moment he didn't move or breathe. When he finally turned to face her, the grief in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by something else, something terrifying. A pure, focused, white-hot rage that had been banked like a coal for years, just waiting for a breath of air to flare to life. "His father was Preacher Gideon," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "And Gideon is the man who murdered my family." The story came out of him in broken pieces, a tale of greed and false piety. Preacher Gideon had wanted Silas's land, a fertile patch by the river. When Silas refused to sell, Gideon had turned the town against them. He'd accused Silas's wife, Annabelle, of witchcraft, of souring the milk and blighting the crops. It was a lie, but it was a lie the people wanted to believe. They dragged her from the cabin, his daughter Sarah clinging to her skirts. Silas had fought, but one man against a mob. They beat him and left him for dead. When he woke, his home was a smoldering ruin, and his family was gone. They burned her, he said, his voice hollow. They burned them both. And Gideon built his new church on my land. Eli was just a boy then, watching his father, learning how to be a righteous man. He looked at Alara, his eyes burning with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. The evil in your town didn't just spring up overnight, it has deep roots. And now it's come up my mountain. He finally understood. The wolf, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just a random tracker. It was history, come back to finish the job. Alara now understood the true danger she was in. She hadn't just fled from a cruel town. She had stumbled into the one place on Earth that was the epicenter of its oldest, darkest sin. She was a spark, and she had landed in a powder keg. "What are we gonna do?" she asked, the words catching in her throat. Silas walked over to a section of the wall that had always looked like it was just rough-hewn logs. He slid a hidden latch, and a piece of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, dark space. An arsenal. Rifles. Boxes of ammunition. Knives of every size. Bear traps with cruel iron jaws. "Do?" he said, pulling out a heavy rifle and checking its action. "Gideon's son sent his dogs to hunt you. He thinks I'm just a broken-down hermit. He's forgotten what a man with nothing left to lose is capable of." He looked at her, his face set like granite. "They've come looking for a fight. This time I'm gonna give 'em one." But as he armed himself, a terrible thought crossed Alara's mind. Silas wasn't just planning on defending them. He was planning on revenge. He had been waiting for this. For years. And she and her daughter hadn't found a sanctuary. They had found the perfect excuse for a war. He was ready to burn the whole world down, and they were standing right next to him. Was he their savior, or was he a man who would get them all killed just to settle an old score? Over the next few days, the cabin transformed. Silas moved with a terrifying purpose, turning their sanctuary into a fortress. He showed Alara how to load and fire a rifle, his hands guiding hers with an impersonal, grim efficiency. He set traps in the snow around the cabin, their locations marked by subtle signs only he could read. He barred the single window with heavy planks, leaving only a small slit to see and shoot through. The warm, quiet space that had promised safety now felt like a tomb waiting for a battle. Lily seemed to be the only one who didn't feel the suffocating tension. She would watch Silas work, her head tilted. One afternoon, as he was sharpening an axe to a razor's edge, she walked up to him and placed her small hand on his arm. "Your heart is loud," she said simply. Silas froze, his massive shoulders tensing. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "It's sad and angry," she continued, her voice clear and unafraid, like a thunderstorm trapped in a jar. Silas stared at her for a long moment, then slowly, he set the axe down. He knelt, bringing himself down to her level. "You're a wise little bird," he said, his voice softer than Alara had ever heard it. "What does your heart say?" Lily put her hand on her own small chest. "It says you're trying to be a good bear," she whispered. "But you have to be careful not to break the things you're trying to protect." The child's words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked from Lily to Alara, and for the first time since he'd told her his story, he seemed to see them not as tools for his revenge, but as people. As a mother and a daughter who had already seen too much pain. The change in him was subtle, but it was there. He still prepared for the fight, but the frantic, vengeful energy was gone, replaced by a grim, steady resolve. He was no longer just a man looking to die while taking his enemies with him. He was a man trying to protect his home. A home that, for the first time in years, held more than just ghosts. One evening, as a new storm gathered, he handed Alara a small, tightly wrapped bundle of oilskin. "What's this?" she asked. "My wife, Annabelle," he began, his voice strained. "She kept a record, Of everything. The tithes Gideon demanded, the land he stole from others, the whispers he started. She saw the evil in him long before I did. It's all in there. Alara stared at the bundle. Why are you giving this to me? Because if something happens to me, he said, meeting her eyes, you get that book to the magistrate in the capital. You and your girl are the only ones who know my story. They'll listen to you. They have to. But Alara had a secret of her own, something she had guarded more closely than her own life. I have one too, she whispered, pulling a small thin book from a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her dress. My husband was the town clerk. He thought Preacher Eli was a saint, until he found his real ledger. It's all there, Silas. The smuggling, the bribes, the names of the men who do his dirty work. That's why they beat me. That's why they cast me out. They weren't just trying to silence me. They were trying to get this book. They stared at each other, the two small books held between them like bombs. They hadn't just stumbled into each other's lives. They held the keys to each other's justice. The war that was coming wasn't just for survival anymore. It was a war for the truth. If they lived, they could burn the whole rotten town down, not with fire, but with words, with proof. Suddenly, a shot rang out, splintering the wood of the door. It was followed by a chorus of triumphant, ugly shouts from the darkness. They were here. The first attack was a test. A half-dozen men, emboldened by liquor and the preacher's promises, charged the cabin. Silas met them with cold, calculated violence. He fired from the window slit, not to kill, but to cripple, to scare them. One man went down clutching his knee, another his shoulder. The rest faltered, their drunken courage evaporating in the face of a defender who wasn't afraid. They dragged their wounded back into the trees, shouting curses and threats. That was just the first wave, Silas said, reloading his rifle in the sudden ringing silence. They know we're armed now. They'll be smarter next time. Alara's hands were shaking, but she held her own rifle steady. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mixed with a fiery resolve. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a soldier in this war. Let them come, she said, her voice low and even. They didn't have to wait long. As dusk settled, a new sound reached them. Not footsteps. The rhythmic creak and groan of heavy timber being dragged through the snow. What is that? Alara breathed. Silas peered through the slit, his face hardened. A battering ram, he said grimly. They mean to come through the door. He looked around the small cabin, his mind racing. They were trapped. The walls were thick, but the door was their weakest point. The hearth, he said suddenly. The back of it. He ran to the fireplace and began pulling at the stones behind the grate. A section of the wall came loose, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel, barely big enough for a person to crawl through. It leads out to the ridge, behind the rocks. A way out. Hope surged in Alara's chest, but Silas wasn't moving toward the tunnel. He was piling firewood and rags at its entrance. You and Lily, go, he commanded, not looking at her. Follow the tunnel to the end. Once you're clear, run and don't look back. Alara stared at him in disbelief. What about you? He finally turned, and his face was a mask of grim finality. I'm going to give them the fire they always wanted, he said. He was going to lure them inside and burn the cabin down around them, and himself. He was going to die here, just like his family. No, Alara said, the word a blade. We are not leaving you. Don't be a fool, he roared, his desperation making his voice raw. This is my fight, my vengeance. It's my truth, too, she shouted back, holding up her husband's ledger. You think I'm going to let you burn it? You think I'm going to let my daughter see another good man die for nothing? No, we fight. Together. A loud, splintering crash echoed from the door. The ram had struck. Lily, who had been hiding under the cot, let out a small cry. Silas looked at the door, then at Alara's defiant face, then at the terrified child. The thunderstorm in the jar, as Lily had called it, seemed to break. The rage was washed away by something else, a desperate need to protect the life that was here, now, not just avenge the life that was gone. "All right," he breathed. "Together, but we do it my way." The door splintered again, the heavy bar groaning in protest. "Block the tunnel," Silas ordered, "but leave a small gap." While Alara stuffed the opening with furs and logs, he grabbed a heavy iron pot and began filling it with rendered bear fat from a barrel in the corner. He set it on the grate, directly over the hottest part of the fire. The fat began to smoke and spit. Another crash, and the top hinge of the door tore loose from the frame. "Get on the roof," he told her. "There's a loose plank in the ceiling." He pointed to a spot above his cot. "Take this." He handed her a bundle of oil-soaked rags and a flint and steel. "When I give the signal, you light the whole damn mountain on fire." She didn't understand, but she trusted him. She climbed onto the cot and pushed at the plank. It gave way, revealing a sky thick with snow and impending night. The cold air rushed in. Below, the door of the cabin finally burst open. Preacher Eli himself stood in the doorway, his face contorted in a mask of righteous fury. Men poured in behind him, their eyes wild. "The sinner and the hermit!" Eli boomed. "Nowhere left to run!" Silas stood before them, a giant silhouette against the fire. He held no weapon. He just smiled, a cold, chilling sight. "You're right, preacher," he said, his voice calm. "Nowhere to run." Eli's eyes narrowed, searching for a trap. He saw the blocked tunnel, the empty hands of his opponent, his men spread out, cornering Silas. "Take him," Eli ordered, "and find me that book." But as they moved forward, Silas kicked the grate out from under the pot of boiling bear fat. The huge iron cauldron tipped forward, sending a wave of scalding liquid across the floor, right at the feet of the intruders. Men screamed as the boiling fat hit their legs, their boots offering no protection. They slipped and fell, their triumphant charge turning into a chaotic, writhing mess. The hot fat ignited as it hit the dry floorboards, and a wall of fire erupted between Silas and the door. Eli and the men who hadn't entered stumbled back, their faces lit by the sudden inferno. From her vantage point on the roof, Alara saw the signal. The cabin itself was now a giant torch. She struck the flint and steel, the sparks catching on the oil-soaked rags. She didn't throw them down. She threw them up, into the massive, snow-laden branches of the pine trees that ringed the cabin. The fire caught instantly, racing up the dry bark, turning the trees into giant, roaring candles. The heat was immense. Snow and ice on the branches overhead turned to steam and then to water, hissing as it fell. Down below, Preacher Eli looked up in horror. It wasn't just the cabin that was burning. The entire clearing was an inferno. The heat was so intense it was beginning to melt the deep snowpack on the steep ridge above them. A low rumble started, a sound deeper and more powerful than thunder. It was the sound of the mountain itself, waking up. "Avalanche!" one of the men screamed. Panic erupted. The men turned to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Fire on one side, a collapsing mountain of snow on the other. Eli stood frozen for a second, his face a picture of disbelief. His perfect, righteous world was literally crashing down around him. Inside the burning cabin, Silas had retreated to the escape tunnel. He pulled Alara down from the roof just as the first wave of snow and rock hit the clearing. The roar was deafening, a physical force that shook the very foundations of the earth. They scrambled through the narrow tunnel, the sound of the avalanche and the crackle of the fire pursuing them. They burst out onto the ridge into a world of white chaos. The cabin was gone, swallowed by snow and flames. The clearing was a churning mass of white. There was no sign of Eli or his men. The mountain had passed its judgment. They were alone, bruised, battered, but alive. Silas held Alara and Lily close as the last of the snow settled, the world falling into a sudden, shocking silence. The fire was out. The war was over. In the gray light of dawn, the world was remade. The valley where the cabin had stood was now a smooth, unmarked grave of snow. Nothing remained. No sign of the fight, no sign of the men. Just silence. They had lost their home, but they had won their lives. As the sun rose, casting a pink glow on the pristine white, Silas looked at Alara, his eyes clear for the first time. The ghosts were gone. "Now what?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He looked down at Lily, who was asleep in his arms, then back at her. He smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "Now," he said, "we find a place to plant a garden. They had the books, they had the truth. They could have gone down the mountain and exposed the rot in the town. But as they stood there, on the clean, silent peak, they realized they didn't need to. Justice had been served, not by men, but by the mountain. Their future wasn't in the past. It was here. They had been cast out, but in the wilderness, they had found their home. Not a place of timber and nails, but a place in each other. A family forged in fire and ice. As spring finally came to the mountains, melting the last of the snow, they found a new clearing, a place sheltered by the rocks, with a view of the rising sun. They built a new home, smaller than the last, but stronger, and in the dark, rich earth, they planted their garden. If you are moved by this story of survival, justice, and the family we choose, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because there are always more secrets buried in the snow.